Next, we come to a story that I've been very interested in as soon as it put its head above the parapet of daily news. And this is a link from Preston Park Museum and Grounds with regards to an old discovery which has recently been confirmed as being something. I am talking, of course, about the discovery in the 1950s of a chunk of metal that has, due to recent work by the inimitable Dr. Chris Capel, been shown to be an Anglo-Scandinavian helmet. Now, this is interesting because actually the first I saw of this news story was on Paul Blinkhorn's Twitter feed, actually, and he went to great pains to say Anglo-Scandinavian, in so much as some people were saying it was an Anglo-Saxon helmet, some people were saying it was a Viking helmet. No, this is a very specific cultural diaspora. This is an interaction between Norse culture and Old English speaking peoples in Britain, um, resulting in, and this is actually the extra layer for me, resulting in actually quite a mundane object, quite an ugly, dare I say, object compared to some of the stuff that we're accustomed to seeing in reenactors' fairs. Now we'll come back to that in a moment, but Chris's work has been interesting. I was interested to see here that he's now an emeritus reader at Durham University. See, he was my supervisor when I was at Durham.
Right,
And
right.
a couple of years ago, he was retiring from teaching, but seemingly he couldn't let go of the work. And who can blame him when you're working with such things as this? A helmet discovered in Yarm, not too far from Stockton-on-Tees, which is Durham's second campus. And it was a helmet that was shown to be made of iron bands and plates riveted together with a simple knop on the top, and below the brow band is a spectacle or eye mask. These are often called spangle helm in terms of their form and
Yeah.
function. It's essentially it's reminiscent of spectacles, but essentially it's a semicircle of metal with a centre bit down the middle there. It protects the nose and the eyes, in particular from your own shield bashing you in the face in
There's the
combat.
famous example. I think people who know about who are interested in the Vikings. It's is it? Oh God, is it Yarmulu in Norway? I never got the pronunciation right, but it's the type. It's the type helmet for that kind of
Yeah,
spectacled helmet, sometimes called a spectacled helm,
yeah.
rather than
Well, and
spangled helmet.
Well, and it's interesting because this helmet is adding to actually a relatively small retinue of evidence from the period. Um, I haven't kept up to speed, don't quote me on this, students at home, as it were. But I think hitherto there's only really been one or two actual helmets from the Viking era discovered and proven to be the case. So this is actually significant in so much as it's adding to that, but also it's adding this sort of workaday feel because lots of people were quite disappointed when they saw this on, for example, on Twitter and Facebook, etc. They were quite disappointed with how clunky it looks. It looks like well, it looks like something that someone I don't know, someone who's aspirational but not quite made it into the aristocracy might wear. It's
Now,
it's
come on, we're talking about consumer economics here.
yeah.
For every Rolls Royce or Bentley, there's a Lada. Or a
Oh,
Trabant.
come on, then. This
This is
isn't
the
a
this is the
larder. This
this is the
isn't.
tra- this is the Trabi of Viking helmets, or Anglo Viking helmets. No, in all seriousness, it's
it's a DeLorean. That's what it is. It's a DeLorean.
oh, the DeLorean was brilliant technology,
No,
and
the DeLoreans
when actually
are terrible. They often rust from the inside out, but they look gorgeous. You see, they look quite nice, but they don't look quite like as sleek as a Ferrari. I think this is a DeLorean. I reckon. Yeah,
back to the future with this one,
yeah.
see what I did there. You look at it, and anyone who knows anything about the construction of armor, you can see it's done in a way that is quick and cheap in that it's segmented components riveted together rather than beaten out of a single piece of metal.
Mhm, mhm.
So you can use metal offcuts. You use a much cheaper but more more vulnerable way of joining the
Mm.
parts together. And you,
But
I can
also
see that
in
it's
this form factor, it's not hasn't even got the advantages of being composite, like for example the Sutton Hoo helmet,
no,
whereby panels can
no.
be
Well,
swapped out.
I,
This
I,
has
I,
been sort of
I,
hammered into one object, as it were, hasn't it?
yeah.
Mm.
And also looking at it, I can see why one of the issues that they've solved, and they seem to solve it to their satisfaction, was whether this thing is genuine. Because when I first saw it and looked at it, I thought, it looks like a Victorian prop
Yeah,
from a Victorian pageant.
yeah,
Somebody's seen a picture of a spectacle helmet in a reference book and made it for the Viking pageant.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
Out of some
um,
farming equipment or something. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's bits
Mm.
of metal plate that were lying around.
Yeah.
And um, but
Yeah,
it's genuine.
it
Yeah,
looks like something that could be found in a theatre.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
I've
Mm.
seen theatrical props like that
Yeah.
when I
And
was actually
yet,
working with
and yet it's genuine. And the thing, and in that sense, I think one of the things that I
it. Mm.
find interesting about it, let's move away from insulting it, I suppose, toward a more positive way of putting it.
We have to treat no, we have to treat it as it is. It's it's clear. It's pretty clearly from the crudeness of the construction.
Hmm,
It's we're not talking Sutton Hoo or even Coppergate. These very highly worked, um, very decorative items. This is functional to the point of brutalism.
yeah,
This is how this is yeah, yeah, exactly. This is brutalist armor
no
in that it
frills.
does nothing but a basic exactly no
Hmm.
frills. It does nothing but a basic PPE job.
Well, but
Um,
also in that spirit of like a sort of positive statement would be to say this is not a Hollywood shape either. In so much as this is as it were so real in terms of its function and form that that sort of very buckety kind of feel is the sort of thing that I imagine is never going to make it onto screen in a Hollywood production, and then in that sense, I find it quite comforting to see this. Yeah, this is what this is. Yeah, well, frankly, at the next Jorvik Viking Festival, I want to see most people wearing this, not your Sutton Hoos, not your Coppergates, uh, not even stuff that's inspired by that material. I want to see this. I want to see chunky, clunky buckets because so, I'm reminded of, and I'm often reminded of when it comes to helmets, of Beowulf and a particular passage,
yes.
yeah, passage in Beowulf, where they comment on how Beowulf has come across these treasures in the lair of a monster, which are no longer gleaming. Then they're not polished and shiny as they should be. So it's one of those things where when you look again looking at Hollywood, often they'll go for that sort of grimy look because these are the dark ages. Whereas actually, clearly from the literature, of the time and the stories of the time, people wanted to, well, and frankly, just for the upkeep, you don't want it to go rusty, and you want to keep it nicely polished and shiny. People would store their chain shirts, for example, in goose fat and wrap it in straw to keep moisture away,
Oh
this
yeah.
kind of thing. Um, so you look after it very carefully, and in this instance, it's hard to see how this would have been particularly shiny in the first place, since it is essentially iron rivet. I mean, you can polish iron, you can get a bit of a shine from it, but again, this would have been a duller colour than the more high-end stuff that, again, in particular, we see, for example, at Sutton Hoo, which and this is important because this comes down to uh, questions about social hierarchy and ranking, which would be visibly um, categorizable. I'm trying to sort of choose my words very carefully there, in so much as color is very important for all manner of things when it comes to trade of goods. When it comes to, so we know in prehistory, it's clear from sites like Varna in the Bronze Age, people were not only gathering precious metals but also interesting colored objects like reds and blues and golds and this kind of thing. And in this sense, a helmet like this. This guy, if there was a family photo, he'd be in the back. Like he would.
He might be at the front. This might, he might.
Oh, I
This
see.
might be
Yeah,
the first
kneeling
helmet
down,
that
like.
ever been. Absolutely, this might be
Mm.
the first helmet that ever been owned by that particular family.
Oh, this is a good point. Yeah, yeah. Mm. Mm.
It's You're right though, and I'm so pleased you picked this story because it does uh, reinforce the point that particularly in high-end museums,
Mm.
we often see the best stuff.
Yeah.
What we don't see is the stuff that the likes of you and I and our families would have been using.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yes. Yeah. And if we're lucky.
yeah,
You know,
yeah, you were looking, yeah,
if we're lucky. In that sense, you're living closer to Nodnol, so you're much likely to have to have access to something like that, maybe. You
helmet,
know.
you were lucky. In
Yeah.
my day, we had to make do with rolled up straw.
Rolled up straw, rolled up. You don't know you were born. You don't know you're born. We would have to sleep in grit, and then we'd roll around in it till our skin was sore. Um, Grit, you say? Grit? Oh, you baby. We had cheese graters for bed. Anyway, so we're rambling on.
Yes.
um, but yeah, it's been good, and this has been a really good story.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, this has been on display at Preston Park Museum since 2012. So what's interesting here is that really Chris seemingly was answering a very particular question as to its veracity and also when and where it came from. He
Yeah.
says actually here, it was a challenging project as the thin iron sheet is now very susceptible to corrosion. It has to be kept in extremely dry conditions, again, keeping moisture away from this sort of stuff. So it was not only simply a question of showing the date when it was created, but also working out how it has survived until it was unearthed in the 1950s. Our analysis showed that it was initially preserved in waterlogged conditions, so no oxygen can enable reactions with the metal and therefore erode it. Only later becoming damaged and starting to corrode when the water table dropped. I've inserted that for reference. He didn't actually talk about water table, but that's what would have happened. Fortunately, it was discovered before it fully corroded away in the 1950s. Although there are half a dozen early medieval helmets from Britain, there you go, the Sutton Hoo and Coppergate helmets being the most famous. This is the first Anglo-Scandinavian, and then they put in here, the BBC have put in brackets here, Viking, although there's some specifics here, helmet from Britain. The only other near complete Viking helmet is from Gjermundbu in Norway, as you were saying. Um, Again, pronunciation apologies if I've butchered that. So this is the second Viking helmet. I was right. So there was one example now, and this is the second one that we know of. The arm helmet remains on display in Stockton at Preston Park Museum. So it's great. It's adding to the library, but also it's interesting, isn't it? So we've got this fairly, and actually even the Gjermundbu example, even the Norwegian example, isn't amazing. It's revealing this kind of workaday reality, and I appreciate that immensely.
Yeah. And I think one other point, and again, it has a bearing on another segment we're going to do later,
Hmm.
but it shows the importance of maintaining accessible archives and having expert people who can go into those archives and look again and ask new questions.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And when actually, I've just noticed, I've completely forgot that we've tagged on a link here, haven't we? To do with archivists and archiving. And it's a cheeky little thing that I've put in here just because I wanted to talk about it briefly. And thank you for helping me there. Um, and that is the
All
news.
part of the service.
The news from TheVerge.com that an unprecedented leak from Nintendo, the computer games company, has turned into a moral dilemma for archivists. In so much as this material has been leaked from a company that has intellectual property rights and could make the argument that actually this material shouldn't be in the public domain, and yet archivists have a sort of moral duty. As we touched on previously, for example, in the case of the National Archives in the US, to try and record things as objectively as possible. In that sense, making a decision about what they should and shouldn't be archiving is in itself uh, often a controversial act. And so here,
And actually, to remind of you,
mm,
the issue in the United States that was that there was an argument over photographs of the women's demonstration on the day after Trump's inauguration,
yes,
President Trump's inauguration, which some people said censored
mhm,
um, the placards that were being carried, so they appeared less anti-Donald Trump.
yeah, and also less what's the word, anatomically um,
Explicit.
explicit, yeah. So in that sense, and in that moment, what we commented on was the fact that in trying to avoid political controversy, they did a political
Disastrous.
act. Um,
Yeah.
and in this instance, what we have is a Viking helmet that survived in an archive. It's been accessible within these archives. This is an argument as well, also for continuing to fund archives, because the stuff in the back and the stuff even on display, it's still live. It's still going to reveal new information, and especially when we have um, so very briefly, yesterday I outlined to you this story, but I'll share it here as well, where when we were doing the BMX archaeology project, we had tremendous trouble um, accessing information confirming when that BMX track was constructed, because we knew from a couple of different sources, one of them being the council's minutes, that they had hired Rob McAlpine, who became Rob McAlpine and Sons, the civil engineering firm, to to tag on for free the construction of a BMX track onto ballast reclamation from a railway line. But because the council kept rubbish archives, we couldn't find any maps linked with this. They just said, "Oh, we looked at our map," they said in the minutes, but they didn't have a copy of the map. Then also, Rob McAlpine themselves, as a private company, and this is where it links to Nintendo, and the broader issue of archives, they had a time limitation on how long they kept information for. So when we were looking for this from the 1980s, 1983, in fact, they had already got rid of that because there was going to be no legal comeback on questions surrounding what they did in the landscape. As far as they were concerned, that was done and dusted. So they'd actually emptied that portion of their archives, much to the regret of the company archivist, because they thought this would be an interesting project to be connected to. So it's a long-winded way of highlighting the value of archives, the value of reassessing collections, um, and also the issues connected with this grey area where private companies often have information that would be in the public interest. That, for example, in the case of Nintendo, actually, so one of the examples is there was a version of I think Star Fox, um, and also Super Mario 64, which they yeah, I know it's gone over your head, but the point is, they have recently actually released previously archived stuff that wasn't released as special elements of products that they put out into the world. So some of this stuff could even be monetized by them. So there's an argument to be said that actually their archive is intellectual property that shouldn't be in the public domain. It's a difficult one, but it's one that's important to consider. And I think this, in this case, a helmet found by public, in public, but by a company who's been hired to do a digging job in the 1950s. This could have been lost in that kind of quagmire
Oh
as
yeah.
well. So it's a roundabout connection. Apologies if people at home find that to be a bit too niche, talking about archives as well. but but this helmet has only revealed what it's revealed to us, and has only become the second Viking helmet in the world because the collection is maintained. It has funding, and also as well, it's accessible to people who are able to reassess it. So yeah, lots to think
I,
about.
a lot to think about. And actually, one other point I just made there on archives, and it's something that was brought home to me very strongly when we were doing the Burma project.
Hmm.
But I mean, I used the when it was open to the public pre-COVID, and now online, I use the National Archive at Kew a lot for the
Hmm.
work that I do. So a lot of it's to do with 19th and 20th century and 20th century military and so on, and it is an amazing repository. But people need to get out of their heads the idea that archives are a complete record, because they're not.
No.
Um, what what reaches the archive, and we can argue about figures, but it can be a relatively small percentage of what actually existed originally.
Mm.
Um, and some areas that are completely blank, partly because maybe there was an incident in which information was destroyed. Half the service records of British service personnel in the First World War were destroyed in a fire in the Second World War.
Mm.
Yeah,
Mm.
um, and that's before we get onto the modern times, and again, doing the kind of uh, work that I do in terms of investigating issues like planning and HMS Victory 1744 and things like that, where you're looking for government documents. We're increasingly finding that politicians and civil servants are using non-recordable methods of communicating with each other to avoid the Freedom of Information Act,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which is bad for democracy and bad for future historians.
Mm.
But they're using things like WhatsApp groups, text messaging, and burner phones
Mm.
rather than using official emails.
Yeah.
In fact, Dominic Cummings has gone out of his way to say to um, uh, people, use my Gmail account. Don't use my government account.
Lock her
Now,
up. Lock. Sorry.
you might say that, I couldn't possibly comment. Uh, but and it's an ongoing struggle. But it is even before we get into issues about how do you archive digital communications, what archives are going to contain in the future is a very interesting debate. The
Mm.
whole Windrush scandal, and it's a huge scandal where
Mm.
people were basically told they had no right to live in the country completely wrongly. It was on the basis of the Home Office destroying crucial information about those people's immigration status, and they're not telling anybody about it.
Mm. Mm.
So it's
Mm.
at one end of it we have the arm helmets, and at the other end of it we have issues like you've just been describing with a tech company, but also even in public life,
Mm.
this issue of archiving and what we keep and how accessible it is and why we keep it. I think it's an important debate, and we need to keep on having it.
Yeah. Yeah. So no apologies. No apologies there. That was a worthwhile connection.